Story 1. Mike Edwards from ALO was crushed to death when a hay bale rolled down a hill and landed on his car as he was driving past. While not the most brutal, it was the worst due to its unlikelihood. Story 2. There are so many who are already mentioned, but one made me think of Naya Rivera. The knowledge that you are drowning, cannot help yourself, and without knowing for sure that your young son will be okay until help finds him is terrifying on many levels. Story 3. Haying Inger won the Academy Award for acting in the film The Killing Fields. Trained as a physician, he escaped the Khmer Rouge in the 1970s. In 1996, he was murdered in his driveway in Los Angeles while resisting robbers who were trying to take a locket containing a picture of his late wife. Story 4. Vic Morrow, Jennifer Jason Leigh's father, was killed in a helicopter accident with two child actors, Micah Din Liu and Renee Shinny Chun, during the making of Twilight Zone, the movie. Morrow and Liu were decapitated by the helicopter's main rotor blades, while Chun was crushed to death by the helicopter's right landing skid. Story 5. Judith Barcy was a voice actress known for her roles in The Land Before Time and All Dogs Go to Heaven. Her father was routinely abusive, and one night he shot his wife in the hallway and shot Judith while she was in her bed. He then set their bodies on fire in the garage before taking his own life. Judith was 10 years old at the time of her tragic death. Story 6. Owen Hart died performing a poorly planned stunt that he did not want to undertake in front of thousands of people. Story 7. Selena Quintanilla was very young when she was murdered by someone she trusted implicitly. She ran the length of a football field after being shot and lost so much blood that the efforts of emergency medical technicians were entirely hopeless, even though they arrived within minutes. Story 8. The main cast of Rebel Without a Cause all met tragic ends. James Dean died in a car crash, Sal Mineo was stabbed in the heart, and Natalie Wood suffered an unusual death at sea. Story 9. Ramon Novarro was tortured to death by two brothers who believed he had a large amount of money hidden in his house. In fact, there was no money, and the murderers left with only $20 that Novarro happened to have on him. Story 10. Isadora Duncan died from strangulation and a carotid artery injury when her scarf got caught in the wheels of a motor vehicle in which she was traveling. Story 11. Nancy Benoit. Her husband drove his knee so hard into her back that he essentially snapped it while strangling her to death. In addition to that, because of who he was and how she and her son died, her legacy has been completely ignored so that no one has to mention his name. Story 12. Several Formula One drivers have tragically lost their lives on the track. Ayrton Senna was struck in the head by a piece of suspension and died. Roger Williamson was trapped upside down in a burning car. Tom Price was decapitated by a fire extinguisher carried by a track marshal whom he struck with his car at 200 miles per hour. Gordon Smiley was severely impacted when he crashed head-on into the wall and retaining fences at 220 miles per hour. Story 13. Brandon Lee was shot while filming The Crow. The original footage of his death is lost, whether due to time or being misplaced in an evidence locker, but the scene where he is killed remains in the movie. Story 14. Michael Rockefeller. The official cause of death is unknown, but the theories are all terrible ways to go. The best-case scenario is that he drowned. However, it has also been hypothesized that he may have been eaten by sharks, consumed by cannibals, or simply wasted away in the wilderness. He was only 23 years old. Story 15. Lane Staley from Alice in Chains. Although it wasn't his first drug overdose, it's sad that he died alone and his mother found him 2 weeks later. He was an amazing vocalist. It's a shame he couldn't overcome his addictions. Story 16. Bob Crane had been bludgeoned to death with a weapon that was never identified, though investigators believed it to be a camera tripod. An electrical cord had been tied around his neck. Story 17. I am having a liver transplant this coming Wednesday and have been suffering from liver failure for a long time. I wouldn't wish anyone to experience a fate like Michelle Trachtenberg's. Story 18. Dominique Dunn was an American actress who was strangled by her ex-boyfriend, John Thomas Sweeney. She fell into a coma and died on November 4, 1982. In a court case that received significant media coverage, Sweeney was convicted of voluntary manslaughter in Dunn's death and served 2.5 years in prison. Story 19. Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader, flew back to Russia in January 2021, knowing he would be arrested upon arrival. He had been recovering in Germany after being poisoned with a nerve agent, which many believe was an assassination attempt by the Russian government. Upon his return, he was immediately detained and later sentenced to lengthy prison terms on politically motivated charges. While in prison, he faced harsh conditions, solitary confinement, and allegations of torture and mistreatment. Navalny remained a vocal critic of Vladimir Putin until his death in February 2024 under suspicious circumstances. Story 20. Chadwick Boseman, a 43-year-old at the height of his career, quietly battled colon cancer for 4 years. Cancer is devastating. Story 21. Julian Sands went missing while hiking, so it is likely he suffered a slow and agonizing death due to starvation and dehydration. Story 22. There is significant physical pain on the list, but I would suggest that the mental pain experienced by Robin Williams or what Bruce Willis is going through is worse. Story 23. I'm going to mention David Carradine. His death was not terrible, but having the entire world know that he was involved in autoerotic asphyxiation and died in that manner is unfortunate. Story 24. Ayrton Senna. I will begin by saying that there have been many horrific deaths in motorsport, including Formula One, with names like Villeneuve and Price coming to mind. However, one particular death almost extinguished the sport, and that was Senna's. He entered the race in Imola having already witnessed the death of Ratzenberger and the near death of Barrichello. He knew the car was very difficult to drive due to the rule changes, and you can see the worry on his face in the footage while he is sitting in the car before the race. Senna had struggled with the Williams car all season, but was on pole position for a race he had to win. There is much conjecture about what happened next, but one theory is that he asked for the wheel position to be extended slightly, which caused the Williams team to weld the steering arm. Under the stress of the race, this snapped, resulting in Senna crashing into a concrete wall at 131 miles per hour. It is hard to imagine the momentary horror of losing steering on a fast Formula One track corner like Tamburello and slowing the car down from 190 miles per hour to 131 miles per hour before impact with the concrete. Sid Watkins, the doctor who knew Senna as a friend, understood right away that the injuries sustained were fatal. A Formula One wheel weighing around 20 kilograms struck Senna's helmet on impact, and the suspension rod pierced his skull. His temporal artery ruptured. A piece of the assembly also went through the visor of his helmet, piercing his face near his right eye, and brain damage was also inflicted from the impact of the steering wheel. This horror was witnessed live by millions around the world. What made it more horrifying for spectators who followed Senna is that we had all seen the footage of him that weekend, how he reacted to the other accidents, how he tried to lead a driver's safety briefing, and how Sid Watkins had tried to persuade him to give up Formula One and go fishing. He was there 1 minute, larger than life, the star of Formula One, and gone the next. The race director and officials knew Senna was probably dead, but the show went on. Formula One carried on that season, and it just seemed wrong. Story 25. Johnny and Matthew Gaudreau's death in 2024 was emotionally devastating on several levels. They were killed by a drunk driver while cycling the night before their sister's wedding, where they were both supposed to be groomsmen. Johnny and his wife had their second child 7 months before the accident, and his widow announced her pregnancy with their third child at the funeral. Matthew's first child was born after his death as well. While the circumstances of their deaths were not particularly gruesome, the emotional toll on the survivors is deeply saddening every time I think about it. Story 26. Vic Morrow, the father of Jennifer Jason Leigh, was involved in a tragic accident when a helicopter landed on him and 2 others. He was struck by the rotor, resulting in decapitation. Story 27. Kirsty McCall was killed by the propeller of a speedboat that ran over her. She pushed her sons out of the way. The pilot escaped responsibility. Story 28. Naya Rivera was a tragic figure who drowned while attempting to save her young son from a similar fate. It is absolutely heartbreaking. Story 29. Linda Darnell. Darnell died on April 10, 1965, from burns she received in a house fire in Glenview, Illinois, early the day before. She had been staying at the home of her former secretary and the secretary's daughter, and had just received notice from her agent of 3 possible movie contracts. She was trapped on the second floor of the home by heat and smoke after the fire started in the living room. The women urged the secretary's daughter to jump from the second-floor window. After her daughter jumped, Darnell's secretary stood on the window ledge, calling for help. She had lost track of Darnell and insisted that the firefighters rescue her before she was taken from the window ledge. Darnell was found next to the burning living room sofa and was transferred to the burn unit at Cook County Hospital in Chicago with burns over 80% of her body. Story 30. Anton Yelchin was pinned between his Jeep and a pillar of his house in a tragic accident when he was 27. I also thought of Natasha Richardson, who died after colliding with a tree while skiing. Story 31. David Carradine was found in a closet at a hotel in Bangkok, asphyxiated with his hands tied. I went to high school with his daughter, Kansas. Story 32. Maybe not a celebrity per se, but Elliott Smith's death really affects me. Not only because of how gruesome it was, but also because of how rushed the investigation was. I feel there are details to it that we will never know. Story 33. I'm surprised no one has mentioned Natalie Wood. She was thrown off a boat by, presumably, her own husband and left to drown. It must have been absolutely terrifying. Story 34. I read an article about Robin Williams' final months written by his wife, and it was very sad. Although his actual death might not have been the worst, I empathize with him. Lewy body dementia is horrifying. Story 35. Isadora Duncan was a world-famous modern dancer. While riding in a convertible automobile, her flowing scarf became entangled in the spokes of the car's rear wheel. The sudden force snapped her neck, killing her instantly. The irony of her death was especially poignant given her reputation as a free-spirited and revolutionary dancer who often wore long, flowing garments. Story 36. David Carradine. I just can't imagine the last thing going through your head is, oh God, this is going to be in the news. For those who don't know, he died while engaging in autoerotic asphyxiation. Story 37. Sharon Tate and Kurt Jaron were among the Jewish actors and celebrities who tragically died in concentration camps. Story 38. John Eric Hexum was the first person that came to mind for me. However, my memory was that he had been accidentally shot by a blank. I didn't remember that he had done it to himself out of boredom. On October 12, 1984, the cast and crew of Cover Up were filming the 7th episode of the series, titled Golden Opportunity, on stage 18 of the 20th Century Fox lot. One of the scenes filmed that day called for Hexum's character to load cartridges into a .44 Magnum revolver, so he was provided with a functional weapon and blanks. When the scene did not play as the director wanted in the master shot, there was a delay in filming. Hexum became restless and impatient during the delay and began playing around to lighten the mood. Imitating a game of Russian roulette, he unloaded every chamber except one, spun the cylinder, then raised the gun to his right temple and pulled the trigger. The explosive effect of the muzzle blast caused enough blunt force trauma to fracture a quarter-sized piece of his skull and propel it into his brain, causing massive hemorrhaging. Hexum was rushed to Beverly Hills Medical Center, where he underwent 5 hours of surgery to repair his wounds. On October 18th, at the age of 26, 6 days after the accident, Hexum was declared brain dead. Story 39. It might not be the worst in terms of being horrific or gruesome, but it breaks my heart thinking about Robin Williams in his final moments, making the decision he did and the possibility that he felt alone with his diagnosis. I know people also view it as a form of bravery, taking control of something uncontrollable and determining his own fate. But the fact that he kept it all inside makes me think of the Pagliacci story. Story 40. I always think about Richie Valens, who died doing the one thing he was afraid of. It must have been excruciating to know that he could have made a different choice right before he died. People often forget he was only 17 years old. The same accident also took the lives of Buddy Holly, J.P. Richardson, and pilot Roger Peterson. Story 41. Dorothy Stratton was murdered shortly after co-starring in the movie They All Laughed, at the age of 20, by her estranged husband and manager, Paul Snider, with whom she was in the process of divorcing and severing business ties. Snyder committed suicide after killing Stratton. She was a beautiful young woman tragically taken in a domestic violence situation. Story 42. Red Fox suffered a heart attack while practicing his lines for a role, but people thought it was fake because he was known for doing that on the television show Sanford & Son. Story 43. The three actors who died in the Twilight Zone helicopter accident were Micah Din Liu, Renee Shin-Yi Chan, and Vic Morrow. Micah and Morrow were decapitated by the helicopter's rotor blades, while Renee was crushed to death. Micah was 7 years old and Renee was 6. Story 44. Not as notorious as Sharon Tate and other horrific deaths, but the murder of Bob Crane still comes to mind repeatedly. He was bludgeoned to death in a hotel room in 1978, and the case remains unsolved. JonBenet Ramsey is another notable case, although most of her fame resulted from her murder. Story 45. It has to be David Christopher Mann. Not a celebrity himself, but he was the son of famous actress Romy Schneider. He died at 14. He forgot his keys and tried climbing over their house's fence. The fence had spear-like spikes on top, and he got stuck on them, bleeding out. Story 46. Left Eye from TLC was on a charity mission when she tragically died in a horrible car accident. Her career was cut short in her prime. Story 47. Danny Locken, known for his role as Barnaby in Hello Dolly, was stabbed to death after a taping of The Gong Show. On August 21, 1977, he competed on The Gong Show and tied for first place. After the taping in Los Angeles, he drove toward his home in Anaheim but ended up at a bar in Garden Grove instead. He was later found murdered in a nearby apartment of Charles Hopkins, who had stabbed him to death. Police discovered a diary under Hopkins' bed, which contained details that prosecutors attempted to use as evidence to pursue the death penalty, asserting that Locken's death was premeditated. However, Hopkins' trial was postponed due to a car accident, and during that period, the California Supreme Court ruled that evidence uncovered after the initial crime scene investigation was not admissible. Without the diary to demonstrate premeditation, Hopkins was only found guilty of manslaughter and received a sentence of 4 years in prison. Critics argued that justice had not been served, as Locken was stabbed more than 100 times. Story 48. Nicole Brown Simpson was stabbed to death by her ex-husband. The crime scene photos were horrific. Story 49. Definitely Sharon Tate. I don't usually cry in movies, but I cried at the end of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Which is strange, I know. I suppose it was seeing an alternate universe where she wasn't brutally killed. That poor woman and her baby. Story 50. Aubrey Graham's reputation. If your only response to allegations of misconduct, cultural appropriation, and being an irresponsible parent is no, or I have never looked at Millie Bobby Brown that way, and you choose to sue your record label for the success of the song, people are likely to celebrate when your ex appears at the Super Bowl to mock you. In all seriousness, consider Tommy Cooper. He was a comedian known for his clumsy tricks and fumbling acts, who struggled with severe stage fright, resorting to alcoholism. Tragically, he had a heart attack on stage while the audience laughed, thinking it was part of the performance. Story 51. Cliff Burton from Metallica and lead guitarist Kirk Hammett drew straws for bunk choices on the tour bus that night. Cliff won and chose his bunk. The bus hit a patch of ice and rolled. Cliff was thrown from the bus, and the bus landed on top of him. Story 52. Kobe Bryant and his daughter Gianna, along with the other victims, suffered a tragic fate. The way they died and the condition of the bodies afterward is heartbreaking. Although I have never seen any pictures, the descriptions of the aftermath are truly saddening. Story 53. Gene Hackman had a tragic passing. I am unsure of the cause, but being undiscovered for 9 days is a terrible way to leave this world. It is difficult to imagine a more horrific fate for a recent celebrity. Story 54. Stevie Ray Vaughan's helicopter collided with a ski hill lift while taking off after a concert at Alpine Valley in Wisconsin. Story 55. Not a celebrity, but Drug Enforcement Administration agent Kiki Camarena was killed by a Mexican cartel in 1985. They tortured him in every imaginable way, including administering shots of adrenaline to heighten the pain. Human beings can be terrible sometimes. Story 56. Princess Diana's death deeply affects me. My mother was pregnant with me when it occurred, and she often recounts how she sat there crying while watching the news. She was chased to death by paparazzi and was left lying there as they took photos instead of offering assistance. Story 57. In a way, Stephen Hawking applies to anyone with a terminal disease that takes a long time to actually kill them. For those who face a relatively quick end, consider Finnish singer Aki Sirkasalo, who drowned with his wife and 2 children in a tsunami in 2004. It must be horrific to struggle to save your loved ones and yourself, only to ultimately fail. Story 58. Isadora Duncan died from strangulation and carotid artery injury when her scarf caught in the wheels of a car. The scarf she was wearing became entangled in the rear hubcaps of her open car. Story 59. Anton Yelchin's death was senseless and heart-wrenching. It must have taken him several minutes to die, and there was nothing he could do but stand there, pinned against the pillar in panic. I watched the documentary on his life, and he was truly something special. I understand that life is never fair and that the universe can be random, but that was a particularly cruel twist of fate. Story 60. Rosemary Kennedy was forcefully lobotomized and then lived for 60 years trapped in her own body. Story 61. Anton Yelchin and Adrian Shelley. Story 62. Adrian Shelley was killed by an undocumented construction worker allegedly for complaining about the noise. Story 63. Claude François. Not exactly in terms of pain, but definitely in terms of how embarrassing it was trying to fix a faulty light bulb in the shower. Well, you don't win a Darwin Award for nothing. Story 64. Old school celebrities. Natalie Wood is notable. She drowned in cold ocean water after never learning to swim and having a lifelong fear of water due to a fortune teller's warning to her mother during her infancy. The circumstances of her death are also suspicious, and it is possible that there was foul play. Isadora Duncan was strangled when her scarf caught in a wheel of her convertible. Jane Mansfield died in a gruesome car crash, but the particularly awful aspect is that her children were in the car with her, though they were physically unharmed. Story 65. Judith Barcy was a child actress who voiced the character Ducky in The Land Before Time. She and her mother were shot to death by her father, who then took his own life. She was only 10 years old. Story 66. I am considering either Timothy Treadwell, who was eaten alive by a bear, his favorite animal that he had spent years with, or Judith Barcy, who was set on fire by her father, who abused her for years. Story 67. John Lennon was murdered by a fan outside his apartment building in front of his wife. There is a picture of his blood-splattered glasses. Anthony Bourdain also comes to mind, having died by suicide. Story 68. Viola Beach has to be up there. I'm not sure what it is about their story, that they were so young and had so much potential, that what happened to them was completely avoidable, that one of them lived long enough to drown surrounded by the bodies of their friends. But it gives me the shivers every time I hear their music. Story 69. Jane Mansfield's death was tragic. It was not a grisly murder, but being ejected through the windshield during a car accident, only to have people taking pictures of her head, which they thought had been ripped off, is quite gruesome. Although it may have only been her wig, it is still very sad. The funeral workers stated she was nearly unrecognizable. Her face was mostly destroyed. Story 70. Kirsty MacColl deserves recognition for her bravery. While swimming with her son, a speedboat entered the restricted area and became uncontrollable. She managed to save her son but got caught in the propellers and tragically lost her life. Story 71. Vic Morrow and the 2 child actors with him were filming a scene for the movie Twilight Zone. In the scene, he is carrying them to a helicopter. All 3 were decapitated by the rotor blades during filming in 1982. Story 72. Anton Yelchin was killed at age 27 when his 2015 Jeep Cherokee rolled backward down the driveway of his Los Angeles home, pinning him between a mailbox and a security fence. He was crushed and lingered alive for some time, trapped and suffocating until his death, the lawsuit stated. Story 73. Vic Morrow and child actors Renee Shinnie-chan and Micah Din-Liu were all killed by helicopter blades in an accident on the set of Twilight Zone. The movie. Story 74. Kirsty McCall pulled her son out of the way of a drunk motorboater and was run over. Someone was paid to take the blame. There was no justice. Story 75. Martha Mansfield. The costume she was wearing had a hoop skirt that caught fire from a tossed match, and she died of severe burns. I do not know if it is the worst, but it is definitely a horrid way to die. She was very young. She was only 24. Story 76. There is a well-known individual who is currently alive, and many people hope he will soon become a strong candidate for this honor. Story 77. I would honestly say Cameron Boyce is among the best. He was so young and left us suddenly, through no fault of his own. Story 78. The dancer Isadora Duncan died in 1927 when her scarf became entangled in the wheel and axle of the car in which she was traveling. Story 79. I thought of Kobe Bryant, who tragically died in a helicopter crash. They apparently knew they were going to die before it happened. He had the awareness of his fate, along with the knowledge that his daughter, her 12-year-old teammates, and their parents were going to perish with him. Story 80. Judith Barcy and Burt Reynolds must have taken around 60 takes, because he couldn't control his emotions during Judith's final line. 5 years before her death, Natasha Richardson starred in a film where Liam Neeson played a character struggling to cope with the loss of his wife. Story 81. Anton Yelchin comes to mind. He was a rising actor and had already gained fame when he tragically became trapped between his car and a brick wall. Story 82. Surely not the worst. Anton Yelchin, the actor who played Chekhov in the recent Star Trek movie, went in a tragic way. Story 83. I am surprised not to see Isadora Duncan, a famous dancer in the early 1900s, who tragically died when her long scarf got caught in a car wheel and axle while driving. Story 84. Judith Barcy, a 10-year-old star, was tragically killed by her father after years of abuse. This story haunts me every time. Story 85. James Dean. I have driven on the stretch of road where he died, and even though the road has improved, it is still a sharp curve. Story 86. Chris Farley's death was tragic. His photo still haunts me, but it's likely he did not suffer given how high he was. Story 87. Anton Yelchin was killed when his Jeep Grand Cherokee rolled backward and pinned him against a brick wall in 2016. That must have been a terrible death. Story 88. And Hetchy drove her car into a house, causing the car to catch on fire, and she was essentially burned alive. She was taken to the hospital but did not survive for long. Story 89. Julian Sand. They only found some remains, so they are not completely sure how he died. Whether it was due to a medical condition, exposure to the elements, or predation. No one knows for sure. Story 90. Many people on this board believe that having your neck snapped by a scarf, which instantly kills you, is the worst way to die. I dream of living in a world where this is the most brutal death my mind can conceive. Story 91. William Holden is unfortunately remembered more for his undignified death than for his immense talent and stardom. He was severely intoxicated alone in his condominium when he fell and hit his head on furniture, bled to death, and wasn't discovered for several days until the maid came in. Story 92. Sonny Bono was my first thought. He hit a tree while skiing. I'm not one to go skiing, but that sounds like an awful way to go. Story 93. Chester Bennington and Etika's deaths are incredibly sad, especially knowing that the latter was bullied to the point of death by his fans, who then pretended to care about him after he passed away. Depression is truly frightening. Story 94. Many individuals struggling with suicidal thoughts are suffering silently, and when they ultimately take drastic actions, those around them often react with shock. Story 95. There are worse ways to go, but for everyone to know that David Carradine accidentally strangled himself while engaging in a sexual act kind of tarnishes his legacy. Story 96. Vic Morrow and child actors Micah Din-Liu and Renee Shinnie-chan died in a helicopter crash on the set of Twilight Zone. The movie in 1982. They were decapitated by the helicopter blades. Vic Morrow is Jennifer Jason Leigh's father. Story 97. Rebecca Schaefer's story is absolutely tragic. She was stalked for 3 years by a man who ultimately shot and killed her in the driveway of her home. Story 98. Elizabeth Short, known as the Black Dahlia, was an American woman found murdered in the Leimert Park neighborhood of Los Angeles, California, on January 15, 1947. While her death was tragic, the mutilation of her body after death was particularly horrific. Story 99. Spinal Tap's first drummer died in a bizarre gardening accident. The authorities stated it was best left unsolved. Story 100. Muammar Gaddafi. Regardless of who he was, this is not something anyone can do to a person and still adhere to the norms of morality. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.